Isabella Martinez turned her key in the lock of their suburban home, the familiar click echoing through the quiet hallway. The scent of vanilla candles lingered in the air, candles she'd lit that morning before heading to work at Moonbeam Cafe. 8 years of marriage had created these small rituals, these predictable patterns that once brought comfort, but now felt more like chains. "David?" she called softly, setting her purse on the console table. No answer. His car had been in the driveway, so he was home from his marketing job. Perhaps he was upstairs taking one of his long baths, a habit that had increased lately, along with the late nights and weekend work emergencies. Isabella climbed the hardwood stairs, her hand trailing along the banister they'd refinished, together during their second year of marriage. Those had been happier times when they'd laughed over paint samples and argued playfully about crown molding. Now, conversations consisted mainly of logistics. Who would pick up groceries? Whose turn it was to call the plumber when they might visit his parents? The bathroom door was slightly ajar, warm steam escaping into the hallway. She could hear the gentle splash of water and assumed David was relaxing after another stressful day. Isabella pushed the door open, ready to ask about dinner plans. Time seemed to freeze. There, in their clawfoot bathtub, the one they'd saved for months to afford, was David. But he wasn't alone. A woman with long auburn hair was pressed against him, her back to the door, their bodies intertwined in unmistakable intimacy. Isabella recognized her immediately. Jessica from David's office, the colleague he'd mentioned increasingly often in recent months. The steam seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, but strangely she felt an odd sense of calm wash over her. This explained the late nights, the distant looks, the way David had stopped really seeing her months ago. The pieces of their crumbling marriage suddenly formed a complete, devastating picture. Neither David nor Jessica noticed her. They were lost in their passion, in a world that had nothing to do with wedding vows or shared dreams, or the woman who had supported David through graduate school and 3 job changes. Isabella stepped back silently, closing the door with the same care she used when leaving a sleeping baby's room. She walked to their bedroom, no, his bedroom now, and pulled a suitcase from the closet. Her hands moved with surprising steadiness as she packed essentials: clothes, toiletries, the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. She left her wedding ring on the nightstand, next to a photo of their honeymoon in Santorini. They looked so young in that picture, so full of hope. Isabella touched the glass gently, saying goodbye to that couple, to the woman who had believed love was enough, who had settled for comfortable rather than demanding extraordinary. 20 minutes later, Isabella wheeled her suitcase down the stairs and out the front door. She didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say. As she drove toward her sister's apartment across town, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the exhilarating fear of an uncertain future, and beneath it, a tiny spark of excitement about who she might become when she finally stopped diminishing herself for someone else's comfort. The old Isabella would have fought for her marriage. The new Isabella was about to fight for herself. 2 weeks had passed since Isabella walked out of her old life, and she'd thrown herself into work at Moonbeam Cafe with renewed purpose. The small downtown establishment had become her sanctuary, its warm lighting and aromatic coffee beans creating a cocoon where she could rebuild herself one day at a time. It was nearly closing time on a Thursday evening when he walked in. Isabella noticed him immediately, not just because of his expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary, but because of the way he carried himself. Confident without arrogance, powerful yet approachable. His dark hair was slightly tousled by the autumn wind, and when his steel-gray eyes met hers across the empty cafe, she felt a jolt of awareness she hadn't experienced in years. "We're actually about to close," Isabella said, wiping down the counter, trying to ignore how her pulse had quickened. "I'm not here for coffee," he replied, his voice rich and warm like aged whiskey. He approached the counter slowly, studying her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but instead made her feel truly seen for the first time in months. "Then what brings you to my little corner of the world?" Isabella asked, surprised by her own boldness. "Alexander Stone," he said, extending his hand. The name meant nothing to her, but his touch sent electricity up her arm. "I own this building." "And several others in the district?" Isabella's eyes widened. She'd assumed their landlord was some faceless corporation. "Oh. Is there a problem with the lease?" Alexander smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face from intimidatingly handsome to devastatingly attractive. "No problem. At all. I make it a point to visit my properties, meet the tenants. But I'll admit, I've been putting off this particular visit." "Why?" "Because my property manager mentioned the woman running this place had an interesting story. Recently divorced, started over with nothing but determination and grace." His eyes never left hers. "I have a weakness for resilient people." Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Your property manager seems to know a lot about my personal life." Small community. People talk, but they only see the surface. Alexander leaned against the counter and Isabella caught his scent. Expensive cologne, mixed with something uniquely masculine. "What I see is a woman who chose dignity over drama, who walked away from comfortable misery to chase something better, even though she didn't know what that something was yet." "You seem to know an awful lot about a stranger," Isabella said, though her defensive walls were already beginning to crumble under his genuine attention. "I know what it's like to feel trapped in a life that looks perfect from the outside but leaves you empty inside," Alexander said quietly. "I know what it's like to wonder if you'll ever find something real." The vulnerability in his admission caught Isabella off guard. Here was this obviously successful, devastatingly handsome man, and he was speaking to her as an equal, sharing his own pain. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. Alexander straightened, pulling a business card from his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed hers as he placed it on the counter, and Isabella felt that spark again, stronger this time. "Because something tells me you might understand," he said. "And because I'd very much like to take you to dinner, if you'd let me." Isabella looked down at the elegant card, then back at Alexander. For the first time since leaving David, she felt a flutter of possibility in her chest. Alexander returned the next evening, and the evening after that. What started as casual conversations over coffee evolved into something deeper, more intimate than Isabella had ever experienced. Even in 8 years of marriage, he would arrive, just before closing, helping her wipe down tables and stack chairs while they talked about everything and nothing. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Alexander said on their 5th evening together, settling into his usual spot at the corner table. Isabella paused in her cleaning, considering. "I used to write poetry. Terrible melodramatic poetry, about love and dreams and all the places I wanted to travel." She laughed softly. "David found my notebook once and, well, let's just say he wasn't encouraging." What was his exact reaction? Alexander's voice had an edge to it that made Isabella. "Look up. He said I was too old to believe in fairy tales, that I should focus on real life instead of romantic fantasies." The words still stung, even now. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. "He was wrong. About everything." "How can you know that?" "Because I've spent the last week watching you transform this little cafe into magic every day. The way you remember every regular customer's order, how you always have a kind word for the college students who can barely afford a small coffee, the way you hum while you work, when you think no one's listening, Alexander stood and moved closer until he was just an arm's length away. That's not someone who's too old for dreams. That's someone who creates beauty everywhere she goes. Isabella's breath caught. No one had ever seen her that way, as someone who created beauty, who mattered beyond her utility to others. "What about you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's something you've never told anyone?" Alexander's hand reached out, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. "That I've been looking for you my entire life without knowing it. That every business deal, every acquisition, every success has felt hollow because I had no one to share it with who would understand the cost." The space between them seemed to shrink. Isabella could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the genuine emotion in his gray eyes. "Alexander," she breathed, not sure if it was a warning or an invitation. "I know you're still healing," he said, his thumb tracing her jawline with infinite gentleness. "I know you need time, but I also need you to know that what I feel for you isn't pity or convenience. It's recognition. It's coming home." Isabella's carefully constructed walls crumbled completely. She stepped into his embrace, feeling his arms encircle her with a strength that promised protection without possession. When he held her, she didn't feel diminished or overshadowed. She felt cherished. "Take me to dinner," she whispered against his chest. "A real dinner. I'm tired of being afraid." Alexander pulled back to look at her, his smile brilliant. "Tomorrow night. Somewhere we can talk without interruption, where I can spoil you properly." As he helped her lock up the cafe, Isabella felt a giddy anticipation she'd almost forgotten was possible. For the first time in years, she was excited about tomorrow. The restaurant Alexander chose was intimate and elegant, tucked away on the top floor of a downtown high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. Isabella had borrowed a black dress from her sister, simple but flattering, and felt beautiful in a way she'd forgotten was possible. "This is incredible," Isabella said, accepting the wine Alexander had ordered. "The view, the ambiance. It's like something from a movie." "You deserve incredible things, Isabella," Alexander said, his eyes never leaving her face. "You deserve to be treasured." Over dinner, their conversation flowed like they'd known each other for years instead of weeks. Alexander told her about growing up poor, about his first failed business, about the loneliness that came with success. Isabella shared her dreams of traveling, her love of old books, her fear that she'd settled for mediocrity for so long she'd forgotten how to reach for more. "What's the bravest thing you've ever done?" Alexander asked as they shared dessert. "Walking away from David," Isabella said without hesitation, "even though I didn't know what came next." "And now? What comes next now?" Isabella met his gaze directly. "I think you know." The rain started as they left the restaurant, a sudden autumn downpour that sent other diners scurrying for cover. But Alexander caught Isabella's hand, pulling her into the rain instead of away from it. "Are you crazy?" She laughed, but she didn't pull away. "Completely," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "Crazy about you." When his lips touched hers, Isabella felt like she was flying. The kiss was everything her marriage had never been. Passionate, desperate, full of promise and possibility. She could taste the wine on his lips, could feel the rain soaking through her dress, but all that mattered was the way Alexander kissed her like she was precious, like she was everything he'd been waiting for. "Come home with me," he whispered against her lips. "Let me show you how a woman like you should be loved." Isabella's answer was another kiss, deeper this time, full of her own hunger and need. Alexander's penthouse was a masterpiece of modern elegance, but Isabella barely noticed the decor. She was focused entirely on the man leading her to his bedroom, on the way he looked at her like she was a miracle he couldn't quite believe was real. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "I've never been more sure of anything," Isabella replied, reaching up to undo his tie. What followed was nothing like the mechanical intimacy of her marriage. Alexander worshipped her body with a patience and passion that brought tears to her eyes. He whispered her name like a prayer, touched her like she was precious beyond measure, loved her with an intensity that reached her soul. Afterward, as she lay in his arms watching the city lights twinkle through the windows, Isabella felt reborn. She wasn't the woman who'd walked out of that bathroom 2 weeks ago. She was someone new, someone worthy of this kind of love. "I love you," Alexander whispered into her hair. "I know it's too soon to say it, but I can't hold it back anymore." Isabella turned in his arms, seeing her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "I love you too. And you're right. It's terrifying and too soon and perfect." 3 months later, Isabella was closing the cafe when David appeared at the door. She hadn't seen him since that night in the bathroom, though her lawyer had handled the divorce proceedings efficiently. "We need to talk," David said, looking haggard and desperate. "I made a mistake, Izzy. Jessica meant nothing. I want you back." Isabella looked at her ex-husband, really looked at him, and felt nothing but pity. "I'm not the woman you left behind, David. I'm not even the woman who left you. You think this billionaire really cares about you? You're just a novelty to him, a charity case. But I know the real you." "No," Isabella interrupted firmly. "You knew the woman who made herself smaller so you could feel bigger. That woman doesn't exist anymore." David's face crumpled. "Please, Izzy, I'll change. I'll be better. I believe you might try," Isabella said gently. "But I don't want you to change for me. I want you to change for you. And I want you to find someone who appreciates who you really are, the way Alexander appreciates who I really am." After David left, Isabella felt lighter than she had in years. She was finally completely free. Alexander arrived an hour later with champagne and an expression that made her heart race. "I have something to ask you," he said, setting the bottle aside and taking her hands. "I've been thinking about expanding into the cafe business, and I know this amazing manager who might be interested in becoming a partner." Isabella's eyes widened. "Alexander?" "Full partners," he continued, his smile widening. "In business and in life." He dropped to one knee, pulling out a ring that caught the light like captured starlight. "Isabella Martinez, will you marry me?" Through her tears of joy, Isabella could only nod. As Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, she knew she'd finally found what she'd been searching for without knowing it. A love that made her more herself, not less. Their wedding 6 months later was small and perfect, a celebration of finding each other against all odds. As they danced to their first song as husband and wife, Isabella thought about the woman who'd walked out of that bathroom a year ago. That woman had been broken, but brave enough to believe she deserved better. "Thank you," she whispered against Alexander's ear as they swayed together. "For what?" "For seeing me. For helping me see myself." Alexander pulled back to look at her, his love shining in his eyes. "Thank you for being worth finding." Later that night, in the privacy of their honeymoon suite, Alexander showed Isabella once again what it meant to be truly, completely loved. And as she fell asleep in her husband's arms, Isabella knew that sometimes the best love stories begin not with meeting someone new, but with finally meeting yourself. The woman who had once settled for comfortable misery had discovered that she deserved extraordinary joy, and in learning her worth, she had found a love worthy of it.